the Real News. I'm Darna Noor. Earlier this month, California's most watched and hotly debated housing bill, SB 50, failed to advance out of a state Senate committee. It's now put on hold until 2020. Also known as the California More Homes Act of 2019, this legislation aimed to take on California's housing crisis by building taller and denser buildings, improve access to public transit by placing affordable housing near transit hubs, and address the state's worsening wildfires. The bill has the support of some affordable housing and transit advocates, developers, and labor unions. Some of them are trying to save it. But other housing and transit advocates and localities and some climate justice groups have actually come out against the bill. Here to talk about this is my colleague on the Real News' Climate Crisis Bureau, Steve Horn, who wrote about this in the latest installment of his series on California's climate policy. The new piece is called California Senate Shelves Bill Tying Affordable Housing and Public Transit to the Climate Crisis. Go read the piece, and thank you for joining me today, Steve.
Good to be here.
So you write about how this bill tied housing and the public transit crisis to the climate change-fueled worsening wildfires in California. What do transit and housing have to do with wildfires, besides obviously needing to live far enough away from where they're going to happen and be able to travel away from them as fast as possible?
Yeah, well, this is a thesis that's been laid out by the Newsom administration and really clearly at a conference that I went to about a month ago in Los Angeles. Basically, the way that the Newsom administration sees these issues as interconnected is that the way that housing has been developed in California is a sprawl-based model of housing in which, kind of the classic criticism of suburbia. People don't really live that close to the urban core of cities. They go drive into the core of those cities for work. They go drive back. That leads to tons of traffic. And by the way, that the housing in those urban areas also happens to be, going back to your question, close to where, those, not the urban areas, the suburban areas, happen to be in areas that were once wildland or open space. That's where a lot of forestry is and sort of the fuel for the fire, if you will, where a lot of the wildfires are taking place. Well, in California, there's lots of housing close to that. Maybe in other states, there's not that much, as much housing close to those areas, but in California, there's tons of housing close to those areas. So the thesis is you get people on transit, you start building up more dense housing close to that transit. It gets cars off the road. Those cars in California lead to, based on California Air Resources Board numbers, 41% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state and rising over time. The state's not meeting its goals on transportation for greenhouse gases, and it's projected to get a lot worse by 2030 based on their own statistics. So basically, the Newsom administration, without explicitly endorsing this bill, has endorsed the spirit of it, saying we need something exactly like this or something resembling it in order to meet climate goals, meet housing goals, and kind of tying it all together in one big shot, which is what this bill was.
So sprawl can fuel wildfires. That's part of why we need more density near centers, it sounds. So we need to build affordable housing near transit. All of that sounds actually really great in theory. So why were some of the most progressive organizations opposed to this bill, or at least relatively unimpressed with it?
Yeah, well, there was sort of a fast track way of doing this, in which there are two main caveats that within the bill it sounded great until you looked into the details. And one of the key details was that in order to facilitate all of these building of these houses around the state, in every city in the state, first of all, most zoning laws would go by the wayside for housing and plans for how the city would structure itself. This bill would supersede that. So obviously mayors and city council members in lots of cities weren't too pleased about that. Cities spend millions of dollars on planning and on kind of structuring their city in a way that makes sense for the people who work and live in those cities. So it came under direct opposition by the League of California Cities, first of all. And I think that was a huge part of why this bill didn't end up going through this year. Second of all is the other big loophole in this bill in order to fast track and facilitate this was that it provided an exemption to the state's mainstay environmental law, the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which basically means that for any major project, there are public hearings, there are public comments, and it goes through kind of a robust process in that way. So to make sure that the final product is something that all stakeholders can more or less agree to. What this bill would have done is gotten rid of that process. And it's part of a broader effort by real estate developers to fast track things beyond just this bill, but in the state generally. There's a lot of complaints about CEQA. People say it's used by NIMBY, or not in my backyard activists, to slow down projects. And so this bill would have pretty much done away with CEQA for housing development in the state. And so, both grassroots environmental justice groups and even large groups like the California Sierra Club came out against the bill for that reason as well.
And there was also some concern that it wouldn't go far enough with actually building some of that affordable housing. Is that accurate?
Yes, yeah, and I guess that's prong three, is that when you really look into it, it was really it's a big state. So we're talking about 45 million people live in this state. So 10 to 15% is kind of a sliding scale of that housing had to be affordable. So that would still affect a lot of people, obviously, we do the math there. But that said, there was another loophole in that bill that said that the housing didn't necessarily have to be affordable by the transit centers. So it could mean that working class, you could kind of do a trade-off in which the people who need the public transit the most potentially would not even have access to it. They might, it might be a trade where the housing gets built somewhere else. And so there's that loophole. There's also the fact that the people, there's a group in particular, housing is a human right. They have said that this is not enough. And also they think that a better solution would be rent control, something that was actually voted down by California voters in 2016. But basically their main argument is there needs to be more. They saw it actually as this was a Trojan horse for big real estate developers to do gentrification in large cities in California to fast track things like luxury apartments and stuff of that nature.
But that concern about like climate justice and transit and housing justice and moves toward toward gentrification were not actually why the bill failed to get out of the Senate committee, right? It was Senator Anthony Portatino, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, who shelved it. Can you talk about exactly how that happened and why?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about why this happened. And I think a lot of people have pinned it on him and said this is a guy who used all of his authority as a leader in a committee to kill the bill. But I think that at the end of the day, there were a lot of competing interests in the bill. I think that the opposition by the cities was a huge one. I think that that's not really being discussed enough in the press. I think that LA Times had an article in which they basically blamed suburbia for killing this bill and the power of suburbia and the fact that that particular representative represents a suburban district within the Los Angeles area. But really, there were a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders who were against this bill. And so without directly naming all of them, I think that first of all, the president pro tem of the Senate, Tony Atkins, who's actually a senator in San Diego, as well as Newsom, his name's not on, and not there as someone who's killed it, but I think that together they probably said, look, we need to go back to the drawing board and come up with another way to do this, considering that, the biggest thing I think that viewers should know is that the two biggest cities in California, their city councils voted against this in resolution. So that San Francisco and Los Angeles city councils have come out against this bill. So you're talking about lots of cities throughout the state of California are not okay with this bill. And I think that that's really the driving force, plus all those other stakeholders that we've been talking about.
So now that this bill is tabled, there are still some localities, right, who are aiming to change California's housing model. You write about how officials from Escondido, a city in San Diego County where you are, were skeptical of SB 50. What are they proposing exactly instead?
Yeah, well, more or less, there's a model that's a lot like what SB 50 aims to do, in that it aims to stop sprawl style development, move people closer to the core of the city where transit is, and build infill or high density housing. And so it's called density transfer. It's basically a market sort of force that creates incentives to do this style of development. And it just passed in Escondido at the beginning of May while SB 50 was being debated, almost, you could say, in direct opposition to SB 50. It even came up in the hearing about that particular density transfer bill that they passed in Escondido, where they said, well, look, if SB 50 passes, this could kind of kill everything that we're trying to do with this density transfer bill. And I want to point to Escondido quickly as something that's kind of symbolic of what's happening, at least in San Diego County, but I think symbolic of the kind of changing dynamics in California and in kind of traditionally conservative districts. That in 2018 they had an election in which it flipped from Republican control to Democrat control. So now it's 3-2, and this was one of the central promises of that particular mayor. His name is Paul McNamara. He said that he was going to do this, and one of the first things he's done out of the gate is move forward on this density transfer measure to, and he explicitly says it's to stop sprawl style development.
All right. And in your next piece, you're also going to be examining some moves in San Diego to further climate, transit, housing policy. So stick around for that, viewers. And Steve Horn, thanks so much for being with me today.
Good to be here.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.